Our speaker today is Julien Domercq, and he is curator of the Radical Harmony exhibition, currently just opened at the National Gallery. He is the curator responsible for Old Master exhibitions at the Royal Academy, and he has been unbelievably busy in the past year. I don't know how he's done it. 3 exhibitions since last autumn, really. First of all, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and Florence. 1504. Do you remember we had a lecture about that in December, which opened last November into early this year. He's curator of the current Kiefer and Van Gogh exhibition at the Royal Academy, and he is also curator of Radical Harmony. I don't know how you do that all in 1 year, but he has. Previously, when he was working at the National Gallery, there's a lot of going from the National Gallery to the Royal Academy, I've noticed. He curated art for Impressionism. Do you remember that lovely exhibition, Inventing Modern Art? He also did the exhibition Drawn in Colour. Do any of you remember that wonderful Degas exhibition? Mostly, I think, they chalk drawings borrowed from the Baroque collection. So please welcome Julien this morning, who's going to talk about his current show, Radical Harmony.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. You're right. At times at the moment, I have to try and really make sure I know what exhibition I'm going to talk about. So I had a sort of moment this morning. Well, is it Kiefer Van Gogh? Is it Radical Harmony? Is it sort of Florence? And it's yes, it's been a busy few months. And just to answer your question, I mean, you do this by sort of not sleeping and not going on holiday. And thankfully, after this, I have a much sort of quieter period where I'll be able to work on project with a much longer lead time. But this is really an exhibition that was a labor of love for me that opened about 10 days ago at the National Gallery, where I began my career as a curator, returned for a few years, and began elaborating this show before leaving for the Royal Academy. And Gabriel Finaldi, the director, very kindly asked me to stay on to see through this exhibition at the National Gallery. It's I'm not sure. Some of you might have seen it already, and if not, well, I hope I'll convince you to do so right after the lecture, so till 6 p.m. today, every day. So it's an exhibition focusing on, in a way, a small section of the show that you mentioned, Angela, after Impressionism, a show which we created 2 years ago at the National Gallery that was really looking at what happens after the end of Impressionism in 1886, and looking at all of these different sort of currents in art in Europe. And one of those is Neo-Impressionism, a movement that emerges quite dramatically in 1886 at the 8th Impressionist Exhibition, which will turn out to be the last Impressionist Exhibition. And it's really the exhibition of this painting, Georges Seurat's Sunday on La Grande Jatte, which sort of shatters, in a way, what was left of Impressionism, even though, of course, it's a much more complicated story. Impressionism was already sort of falling apart. Someone like Renoir was not exhibiting at the show. Cézanne had returned back to the south of France. But it's really the exhibition of La Grande Jatte marks really a sort of critical point in the story of Western art. I think we try to argue in our exhibition. And if you like, triggers a move into the great movements of the 20th century. I mean, I should say that La Grande Jatte is not in the show. It's the great painting for at the Art Institute of Chicago, a monumental work that Seurat, very young Georges Seurat, exhibits at the 1886 Impressionist Exhibition. And it really has this sense shockwaves, not only because it's a work on a grand scale, which Impressionists, for the most part, at least until that time, had not worked at. They worked on sort of smaller, the sort of pictures you could, exhibit in a sort of bourgeois Parisian living room. It's only later that Monet starts painting these large sort of water lily canvases. And so Seurat is sort of reclaiming scale, but also he's doing, I think the most important thing that Neo-Impressionism does, and I'll go on to describe the actual style, is, if you like, Neo-Impressionism per se can be seen as the last step in the representation in art being naturalist. I mean, in representing the world as you see it outside, as you see it in front of you. The idea that Impressionists were trying to capture a sort of fleeting moment, like the change of landscape, a cloud in the sky, a changing of light on the facade of a cathedral, for instance. And the Neo-Impressionists, in a way, are the first artists that take a step in a direction that is going to remove art from subject matter, from being simply about depicting the world as you see it, into a sort of more theoretical, more imagined approach. And what the Neo-Impressionists do is they take, if you like, they move away from what Impressionism was really sort of empirical representation. You for the most part, imagine taking a canvas out in the open air, you depict what's in front of you with these very free, loose brushwork. The Neo-Impressionists decide to really use scientific theory, and particularly the theories of optics, to govern the way you're going to paint. And there were theories that had been developed throughout the 19th century. Famously, someone like Eugène Delacroix, much earlier in the century, uses the theory that is demonstrated by this color wheel that I've put on the screen, the very color wheel that's also exhibited on the first panel of the exhibition on Trafalgar Square. And it's the theory of complementary contrasts, which mainly means that if you pick two colors at the opposite end of this color wheel, there will be two colors that have nothing to do with one another. So say if you pick red and the direct opposite, which is green, there is no red in green. And therefore, when you put these two colors next to one another, they will mutually enhance themselves. So green will be more vibrant, and as will the red be. And there's sort of, with the three primary colors, you have red and green, yellow and purple, and blue and orange. And these are these great colors that reinforce each other. And the Neo-Impressionists are going to use that to really make colors vibrate onto the canvas. There's another theory as well, which is actually later was disproved scientifically, which is a theory called optical mixing, which is essentially if you put, say, yellow next to red, two distinct dots of yellow next to red, at a distance, your eye will mix them together to create orange. And the theory is that this will create a more vibrant, more punchy colors that if you had just mixed the two pigments together, which was thought to sort of dull down the color. This is actually how one sees color through our eyes, sees color, the colors transmitted through light. That is, however, not what happens on a canvas, but it creates a sort of effect of a sort of shimmering effect. And so they bring these styles together, rather these theories together, to paint, which is really seen as this sort of almost like metaphorical passing of the baton from one generation to another. You have young artists that decide to really use science to create a new and modern art, hence the name Neo-Impressionists. I mean, the New Impressionists, which is a name that is given to them very, very early on by Félix Fénéon, a great art critic, great supporter of the movement, and which is why it's the name we use in the exhibition. I mean, it's a style that is better known as pointillism, which the artists themselves rejected quite, very, very strongly, very vehemently, because they sort of thought it reduced the style to what is in effect just artifice, which is the act of painting in dots. And actually, the important thing of this technique is how it brings colors together, as opposites to reinforce. It's really about what they also call the divisionism of color, more than about the implication in dots. And Signac, one of the great Neo-Impressionists, who actually theorizes Neo-Impressionism a bit later on, says that le Neo-Impressionisme ne pointille pas, il divise. So the Neo-Impressionist doesn't paint with dots, but it divides. Hence that it's really about color. The dottedness of these paintings is just a means to an end. It's a technique. Another side of this exhibition, so I should have said it's an exhibition that tells two stories on parallel tracks. It tells the story of Neo-Impressionism that I've just started to sketch, And it tells the story of a remarkable collector, Helene Kröller-Müller, who was German. She was born near Essen in Germany, but she moves. She marries a Dutchman, moves to Holland, and it's really there with her own money. So she's formidably wealthy. Builds a great collection of modern art, which she then ends up giving to the Dutch state in 1939. In 1938, the Great Museum opens. She dies in 1939. She's better known for having built the largest collection of paintings by Van Gogh to have ever been assembled outside of the family's own collection. So in her lifetime, she buys 90 Van Goghs. And it's quite something. The museum still owns 88 of them. And until the Van Gogh Museum opens in Amsterdam in the 1970s, it is the one greatest sort of hold of works. And actually, when people had wanted to go see Van Gogh at scale, they would go to the Kröller-Müller, and indeed that is something Anselm Kiefer does when the other exhibition. I've worked on Kiefer Van Gogh. When he wants to see Van Gogh's work in the 1960s, he has to go to that museum, which is set in a formidable setting, actually a bit not unlike sort of Kenwood, in a sort of beautiful sort of parkland, a building that relates sort of wonderfully with the exterior and the interior. It's a place I would really encourage you to go to. But so she collects Van Gogh, but her sort of the second pillar of her collection is Neo-Impressionism. And which, it's interesting, she describes later on how she sees Van Gogh as the artist who, and I'm sort of paraphrasing her, I'm sort of butchering her the quote, but she sees him as the artist who punches you in the guts. It's like this sort of very raw sort of emotion. And then she says how she then meets the Neo-Impressionists as a sort of foil, as a way to become more serene, to sort of regain her serenity, to meditate. And so she's really collecting these two great things alongside to sort of counterbalance one another. And it's particularly wonderful feature of that museum as well is not only is she buying these works really early, Van Gogh, but as I said, but also the Neo-Impressionists in the 19-teens. I mean, these works had only been painted about 20 years before. But she also displays them in a museum. This is a picture I took a few months ago of the Neo-Impressionist gallery at the Kröller-Müller Museum, a museum that is designed by Belgian architect Henry van der Velde, who starts his career as a Neo-Impressionist painter. And so there's a wonderful sort of, if you like, continuity between the design of the building and the works they exhibit, what Germans would call the works of Gesamtkunstwerk. And so the exhibition is trying to tell these two stories on parallel tracks, not to tell a grand story of Neo-Impressionism as a movement, but to really see Neo-Impressionism through Helene Kröller-Müller's eyes, which I find is particularly interesting because her collection is the greatest collection of Neo-Impressionism in the world, really. And it's particularly world-leading because she doesn't only collect the French artists, but she also collects the Belgians and the Dutch who painted in that style. And therefore, her collection really allows us to look at Neo-Impressionism as a sort of what we can call the first sort of coherent international art movement, one that really sets, if you like, the standard for, something we take very for granted today when you look at all the great isms of the 20th century, these artists that decide to paint together in a similar style across borders, but it's really Neo-Impressionism that becomes the very first one. The show opens with the two sort of French, if you like, the two French great artists. You can't avoid the prominence of Seurat as the inventor of Neo-Impressionism and of that technique, and then his follower, Paul Signac. And these are two works, this is the order you see them in the exhibition as you walk in. Two works painted, just 1 year apart, in 1887 for Signac, 1888 for Seurat. And we wanted to sort of show these works together right at the beginning to contradict the great criticism leveled by critics at Neo-Impressionism in 1886, which is simply that this is a death of painting. you are, it's painting is only done through dots, so you're removing individual mark making. And you paint this complete opposite of say, Sargent, which is so expressive in the way it's painted. And so you're killing art. This is the end of art. And some critics really see that as a sort of endpoint, as a very, very dangerous thing. And to me, almost by seeing these two works, you see quite clearly that this is not the case, that actually they might be painting in dots, but these are two works that reflect a very, very different sort of sensibility and approach to painting. I mean, you see in the Signac on the left is sort of more muted, maybe a little more lyrical, and Seurat is so sort of geometric, spare, very composed, sort of very cold, almost. I mean, a remarkable piece of painting. We also showed these two very different pictures by Paul Signac in the first room of the show, painted in 1888, so the same summer that Seurat paints the picture I've just shown you. Signac is in another port in Brittany on the French northern coast, painting these two views, and this is to really reflect a big part of Neo-Impressionism, which is also that it's one of the first times that artists start painting in series, which again becomes very commonplace as you move into the but the idea they would produce. So I think Signac for this place Portrieux in Brittany painted 9 paintings. And the idea is that he was showing you the same place seen from different angles and different varying weather conditions, not to give you a sense of the place at a particular time on a particular day, like the Impressionists would have, but rather through a series of 9 works, give you a sort of all-encompassing synthesis, if you like, of one place. And that's what Signac refers to this series as a synthesis of this small Breton port. And you see how he's depicting the same lighthouse twice. There's one where you see it at the end of the jetty on the right, and it becomes much more the subject of the painting with the work on the left. But you also see immediately how he starts using landscape to its full sort of geometric potential. These are works that are incredibly well sort of constructed and composed. And a big transition as well in this first room of the show is you meet the first non-French artist in the exhibition, which is the Belgian painter Theo van Rieselberger, which is shown here on the left, with this sort of wonderful sort of lyrical painting, also painted in Brittany a little bit later, this one in 1889. And you just see how remarkably different in flavor it is. And I think you really get that in the first room of the exhibition. There's much less geometry at play. The palette is much sort of higher hued. It's a very luminous painting. And we've shown it next to the National Gallery, or rather the picture from Tate on long-term loan from the National Gallery. At the National Gallery, there's the Bec du Hoc by Seurat. Just again to show two relatively similar paintings, but shows how different the sensibility is. And it's even more interesting when you consider, let me see if the pointer actually work. It doesn't on the screen. I'll point it out to you. And I'll say it first so that people online can hear me. About how he starts working on a smaller canvas and then expands it as he goes on. So the original line of the canvas is sort of about here. So you have to imagine this work being much more tightly cropped. And then you almost can't resist to open it up to make it much more decorative, much more sort of in a way, I mean, much less avant-garde and much more but visually appealing. And a last picture in the first room of the show is this work by Camille Pissarro from the National Gallery's own collection, a work that had disappeared for about a century and that reappeared when it was given in someone's will to the National Gallery about 4 years ago. The great sort of surprises that can come your way. And all of that work is really good to say that Camille Pissarro was from the generation of the Impressionists, but he is somebody who first invites the Neo-Impressionists to exhibit in 1886, and who tries his hand at the Neo-Impressionist style, and so painting on dots of color And yet, when you look at this work, you cannot help to feel that it still contains a much more sort of impressionist ability, a sense that of weather, of the time changing. It's much less sort of frozen in time as Impressionist paintings tend to be. But for sort of something completely different and sort of contrast that hits you when you go see the exhibition, which we very much wanted to be that way, is I think people have a sense, and I mean I have it too, when you go see a new Impressionist picture, say La Grande Jatte, if you're lucky to go to Chicago, or the Bathers at Lanière, the great big Seurat at the National Gallery. There are pictures that are sort of film public favorites because they're so quiet and serene and sort of meditative. I think one could even push it and say they almost become a little bit sort of chocolate boxy as pictures. They're works that people are so used to seeing. And in a way, art has been so daring afterwards that they just seem like very, very beautiful pictures. And yet there's, I mean, great, and that's why the show is called Radical, for me, so I was very keen to have that word in the title of the exhibition, is it's both a very radical style of painting, as I've described, but there's also very, very strong political ideas that underpins it. Most of the Neo-Impressionists were anarchists with varying degrees of militancy, if you like. I mean, I should say that anarchy in the 19th century means something very, very different than it does now. It's much less sort of trashing the center of the town with rocks and throwing bombs at people. You'd be surprised if you read a anarchist treatise from the 19th century how many times the word harmony comes up. And the sense that it was much more a movement, yes, about a reaction against authority, against the authority of the state, but the emphasis was really put on how human beings could organize themselves, in an autonomous way and live together in sort of perfect harmony, which aligned itself in a way with the painting style, which also strived by painting in the way that I described, strived also to achieve a sort of balance and a harmony in the way that these paintings painted. That was a very important tenet of the movement. And yet, as I said, the political underpinnings were very, very strong, and that's something we demonstrate in the show with these two works by Jan Toorop, the first sort of Dutchman that we encounter in the exhibition. An artist that you might, if you came to after Impressionism, you would have encountered through one painting, which is actually the one on the left that returns to the National Gallery for this exhibition. And we decided to borrow it again to be able to show it next to the painting on the right from Helene Kröller-Müller's collection. The two works that were intended of as a pair. The one on the left is called The Evening Before the Strike. The one on the right, The Morning After the Strike. And the one on the left shows, it's the evening. There's a couple, a man and a woman. Actually, the woman is creating a small child. You can see when you look at it in the show, you can see it's sort of little hands that are painted, a few dots, very beautiful. And they're sort of cowering in the fields, sort of full of anxiety for the strike to come. And actually, when you look at that figure, its two hands, it's not without sort of echo with Munch's The Scream, in this real sort of intense feeling of sort of despair and anxiety. And then in the morning picture, you can see the same family, the woman holding the baby, but the man is being carried away, dead. There's sort of Christ-like figure, like sort of Kita with his arms sort of hanging down, showing the sort of like the inimitable destiny of the working man, sort of crushed by society because he dared rise up against the established order. So it's a very sort of militant, very punchy subject. But what I love with this pair is also how it becomes a visual pair of opposites. The evening picture, of course, sort of darker tones, more muted tones, made to contrast with the morning picture, which is all painted in pinks and lime greens. I mean, it's a riot of colors, this painting, seemingly in sort of complete contrast with its subject matter. Such a beautiful picture with such a dark subject matter. This is another work by Jan Toorop, The Glimmer of the Setting Sun. I should say Jan Toorop is really fantastically underrated, not very well-known artist who, or at least in this country, who both works in the pointiest and Neo-Impressionist style, but also at the same time in a symbolist sort of whirlwind style. Which is inspired from, in some part, from non-Western art, from Indonesian art, because he's born in Java, which was then a Dutch colony, and moves to, his mother is of mixed sort of Indonesian heritage. His father is Dutch. And he's really one of the first like non-European born members of the European avant-garde. And you see him, and this is a little nod to, in a way, another show at the National Gallery, a show. There's also an exhibition on a room, showing room 1, a free exhibition on Jean-François Millet, which you can see here on the right. And you could say that the words are they're really worlds apart, but you can see how Millet depicts sort of the peasant life, and you can see how even at the very avant-garde of painting in this radical movement that Neo-Impressionism was, Toorop is reflecting on the composition of Millet's. This is L'Angélus, his most famous painting, and you see how he takes the same characters with still the church in the background. So the moment you hear the bells according to prayer at the end of the working day, and you can see even how the wheelbarrow and the shovel have been united in the background of the work by Toorop. This is probably the most political, sort of punchy picture. I mean, it's a work you could easily confuse for a sort of Soviet neo-realist painting. Sort of social realist painting from the 1920s, 1930s. And it was painted in 1899 by probably the most anarchist of all the Neo-Impressionists, the French, Maximilien Luce. Luce was a member of his sort of anarchist circle in the 14th arrondissement of Paris, and he was actually imprisoned in 1894 in this big sort of, as a lot of anarchists were being rounded up in the aftermath of the assassination of the French president in 1894. So like a very engaged political man, and here he depicts a foundry. It's work on a monumental scale. It's about the size of the screen, of these sort of high sort of color contrast. And a picture that is, yes, about sort of struggle and showing you the sort of the inferno of an iron foundry, but he is also applying sort of anarchist principles and showing you how workers are working together to the point that some of them on the right of the picture are able to enjoy a little bit of rest. So sort of it's an anarchist manifesto, if you will, as well as depicting the toughness of labor. And this is the result of him, spending quite a lot of time going to these foundries next to the town of Charleroi in southern Belgium, which were really seen as sort of one of the worst places on earth in terms of harsh working conditions. And he goes there repeatedly with his Belgian Neo-Impressionist friends and takes it as a subject matter. It's an incredible painting. And we're showing it next to this wonderful work from the Met. And you can see here, maybe I should have said at the beginning that the exhibition is conceived of about 2/3 of work from Helene Kröller-Müller's collection. And they're then reinforced with a group of about 22 loans that come at sort of specific points to sort of augment the story that we're trying to tell. And in this case, this is probably Maximilien Luce's greatest painting, I think, from the collection of the Met in New York, painted about 10 years before. So this is 1890. And it's really, it's not as sort of, you could say, militant as the picture I've just shown you. Here he's just really focusing on the everyday routine of labor. A sort of modest man getting dressed in a sort of garret room under the roof. It's all very modest, but he sits very content. He's got art displayed on the walls. It's about the routine of simple things, getting ready for work in the morning, and very much the sense of the artist, because he's actually a young artist, was a friend of Luce, the person depicted. in the sense that, you know, for them, an artist is no more than another artisan. It's a routine labor, it's hard work. And you see how, to me, it's a work that perfectly brings together the formalism of the style with its, you know, these geometric lines of the light sort of flowing through the window of the roof, the brilliant use of the primary colors next to one another, all of that coming together with its sort of political underpinning. London features in the exhibition as well. These two works by Seurat again and Georges Seurat, a Belgian Neo-Impressionist, show you in a way the fascination that these artists have for London, as, you know, at that time, really the most industrialized city on earth. Described by a lot of people as a, you know, profoundly ugly city because of its chimneys. I mean, this is the South Bank, this Charing Cross Bridge on the picture on the left. On the right, sorry, leading towards the South Bank. And yet they find in this industrial landscape a great sort of beauty and, dare I say, sort of harmony in sort of depicting sort of the London smog and the effects of light. This is a sort of other facet of Neo-Impressionism. This is Signac's study for a huge mural that is entitled in the time of harmony, the golden age will come. A very, very large picture, and still to this day, the town hall of the working class suburb of Paris, Montreuil, the town hall of Montreuil. And it's almost a utopian vision of what it would be like if you moved to the south of France, you become at one with nature. You do like Signac, it's Signac himself who's sort of picking a fig from the tree, and you can live in much greater harmony, which is indeed what he ends up doing when he moves to Saint-Tropez. In the later 1890s. This is the one Van Gogh in the exhibition that's sort of irresistible, not to Van Gogh, and when you can borrow a picture like this, I'm not going to say that. But this is really to illustrate what some artists that we wanted to slightly widen the scope of our understanding of Neo-Impressionism, because sometimes it is just reduced to pointillism, to the idea that these works are just painted with dots. And Van Gogh is an artist who is inspired by Neo-Impressionism, paints about 2-3 works in a dotted style, but very quickly moves away from it, moves to the south of France, and this is a work he produces in Arles in 1888. And you can see how, despite the fact he's not painting with dots, when you look at the field of the foreground, you can see it's all built on this theory of complementary contrast. And he's painting sort of this blue next to orange, really creating this real sort of tension, both color, like, you know, making the other one, reinforcing the other one, making it appear more vibrant. And again, this other sense of the artist identifying with work. You know, Van Gogh for Seurat is like it's making art is a tough pursuit. You know, it's like the worker. You wake up early in the morning, you're sowing, there's the seeds in the field. It's a repetitive, but ultimately it's a rewarding task. This is the last work in this section, which is a work by Anne Bock. She is the only, so the guiding principle of the show, which is called, the subtitle of the show is Helene Kröller-Müller's Neo-Impressionists. The rule that I set myself is that we would only show works by artists that Helene Kröller-Müller collected. And of course, I broke the rule and did it only once. And this is for Anne Bock, who was a member of Louvain, who was the great sort of avant-garde artistic society based in Brussels. She is better known as the only person to buy a painting by Van Gogh in his lifetime. At an exhibition. I mean, Van Gogh gave exchange pictures with other artists or sold them for a few francs, but she buys it properly at an exhibition for a sort of normal giving price. And she's mainly sort of thought of as that. But she was also a painter or a writer, you know, and a real member of the Neo-Impressionists. And to me, it was always right to write her in that story of Neo-Impressionism. Because I really do feel, especially when you're doing a show at a place like the National Gallery, you have sort of you're contributing to shaping the canon. You know, whether you like it or not, the sort of the catalogue will become, they're widely diffused. It will become one of the reference points when people think about Neo-Impressionism. And so to me, it felt particularly important to write her in that story. We have two works by her in the show, and here you see how she's looking at these sort of in a very modest village church, people bowing in front of it. A bit like Van Gogh only uses Neo-Impressionism selectively, and you can particularly see it at the top, showing the place that the sky meets the wall of the church, and how she uses the dots to sort of reinforce the contrast between sky and wall. And you meet her also in the exhibition in a portrait. This is a portrait by her, by Theo van Rieselberger, so the Belgian artist I mentioned at the beginning. A wonderful work from a small museum in Springfield, Massachusetts, really showing her as a sort of confident painter, painted in these incredibly high hued colors. The wonderful effect, if you look at the palette that she's holding, where the dots sort of become this sort of whirlwind of color. I mean, it's such a beautiful, beautiful painting. This is another portrait of Maria van Rieselberger, who was the artist's wife, probably the greatest Neo-Impressionist painting that was ever produced. Is this work by van Rieselberger that we borrowed from the museum, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp. I mean, I find it sort of magnetic, really, really beautiful, beautiful painting. And it really sort of illustrates in a way the great contradiction in Neo-Impressionist portraiture, which is that, you know, as I described it as a style that seeks to sort of simplify, to synthesize, to simplify things. And so you could say that in many ways it is a complete antithesis of producing someone's likeness, which is, you know, not synthesizing, not simplifying, but capturing really someone's soul and their actual sort of physical appearance. And yet there's a very strong school of Neo-Impressionist portraiture that emerges particularly in Belgium, and Van Rieselberger, you could say, is the great master of it. Such a beautiful, I mean, it's in a way the you know, demonstration of complementary contrast, that she's got this beautiful purple dress, the background is sort of yellow orange, so really sort of they both reinforce one another. And he plays with geometry as well, the sort of these, you know, the very linear horizontality of the harmonium, this small organ that she's just momentarily stopped playing, contrasting with the volutes of the folds of the dress, of the tassels of the curtains sort of falling onto the harmonium itself. It's a really sort of wonderful picture, really giving you the sense that she's just stopped talking. When you look at it up close, you see how he so beautifully sort of captures the frizzes of her blonde hair and the way the light sort of catches onto them, and then reinforces if you look particularly at the area around sort of her nose and mouth, the way that the sheet music, the white page suddenly gets much darker to reinforce the contrast between her pale skin and the background, which is something that Seurat uses again and again. So profoundly naturalistic, but also profoundly artificial at the same time. It's fascinating, beautiful painting. We also have two works by Jan Toubak, who painted, also, these are the two only Neo-Impressionist portraits that he painted. We displayed them as a sort of pair. They're not strictly speaking a pair, but I think there's such a, I find it hard to believe that he didn't somehow think of them as related to one another. You can see on the left, it's a woman called Marie-Annette de Lange, who was a women's rights activist in The Hague at that time. Really, she probably designed the dress that she's wearing. She was helming the sort of the group for the betterment of women's dress. And you see how she's in her work. The work is all curves and sort of sinuous patterns. And next to her is this progressive academic, Dr. Timmerman, and there it's all much more geometric, much more these sort of right angles, lines, the sphere of his head. They're both sort of wonderful sort of foils to one another. And then two beautiful works on paper, two drawings in the Neo-Impressionist style. Seurat's own portrait of Paul Signac, which is a wonderful thing, very muted work that he creates by just running this sort of black pastel, this Conte crayon pen against a very rough textured paper to create this sort of dotted effect, but in black and white. And then the portrait of Jan Toorop himself by Georges Seurat, where you actually, when you look at it up close, you see how he's actually starting to draw in dots. And a really interesting thing of how do you translate a style that is both very painterly, but also about color into black and white. And these are two sort of wonderful answers to that. Two other wonderful, I mean, Seurat drawings are just such great things. This is in the next section of the show. These are two sort of studies for Lagrangeat, the work from Chicago that I showed you, and particularly the one from the on the right is just so incredibly spare, and it's a bit like a chess piece, you know, had gone on to sit on the bank of a river. It's just so simplified and schematized. It's a fantastic thing. And next to it, we exhibit this work from a private collection. I mean, it's an astonishing little painting. This is to be moving on to the next section of the show, which is really about centered around the most important loan in the show, which is Seurat's last large painting, which I'll get to in a second. And this is the reduced version of his work Poseuse, a work that the large version is at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And you sort of see three models standing in front of Lagrangeat in the artist's own studio. And this is Seurat sort of being sort of irked by critics that had responded to Lagrangeat, not only by saying it's a death of painting, but even the ones that accepted that there was some merits to the style said, well, it's all well and good, it looks good for landscapes, we'll give you that. But it's never going to work with a nude figure. And that's the sort of at the top of the pyramid of what the great things you can do in art, and so therefore the style is worthless. And Seurat really takes that on, and well, I will do a great sort of new picture. So he produces this work, both sort of referencing Lagrangeat in the background, showing you three nude women, which you could read almost as a sort of the three graces. And they actually all have classical references from antiquity, even the one on the left, sorry, probably from a painting by Ingres. And also he does this funny effect where you feel, well, are they posing for Lagrangeat? Or are they stepped out of Lagrangeat? Because you see on the floor, they're wearing all the clothes that the figures are wearing in the painting. So is it sort of some sort of strange paintings that become somewhere? And also, and that's a slightly more debated issue, but I believe quite firmly that, you know, they're the same model. They're the same women three times. And he's not really trying to tell you that, you know, he could have made one blonde, or he could have done something to differentiate them, and he doesn't. And so to me, there's almost, you could also read it as, and this would be very daring if that's what he was doing, we'll never really know, but that he's depicting the same model three times in three different moments of the sitting. So, you know, on the left, she's undressing, in the middle, she's posing, and on the right, she's dressing again. And so breaking down the idea that a painting is about a single moment in time, and actually, you know, creating the whole posing session in one, which is, you know, in a sense what he's doing with his landscape, looking at things from different angles at different times, but you're bringing that into one picture. A fantastic little painting. This is the sort of pièce de résistance of the exhibition, and I realize I need to accelerate a little bit, so I promise I will finish roughly on time. This is Georges Seurat's Le Chahut, or rather Chahut as he called it, without the le. Chahut is the last large painting that he exhibits before he dies. He dies very young, Seurat, in 1891, age 31. It's the works that he referred to as his toiles de lutte, the battle canvases. So works on the grand scale, so reclaiming scale for the avant-garde, like the sort of big paintings that were exhibited in town halls, that were shown at the official salon. And really sort of trying to push at the boundaries of what, you know, of conventional art, if you will. I mean, this is both unconventional in the sense that it's depicting a scene that a few years before you would never have imagined depicting on canvas at scale, which is a scene of very popular entertainment. So it's a Chahut. It's another name for the can-can dance, which was so unpopular that it was, well, rather no, it's very popular, but which was so so judged so scandalous that he was banned in Paris for a few years. I mean, there were even apparently, policemen that were, going around the Café Concert trying to make sure that the women were actually wearing underwear, which they're not. It's a very alluring dance, and you can see the figures, particularly the figure at the bottom right, is sort of keeping straight up. So it's a very rude painting. And that's the sort of stuff you would see in prints or in sort of popular media. And indeed, you see posters for the Café Concerts. There's a work by Toulouse-Lautrec, for instance, that's exhibited that I referenced to in the catalogue. But he's taking it, making it even bigger, putting it on ground large paintings, but claiming, in a way, popular entertainment for the grand style. And in a way, sort of using this rude topic to make a beautiful, what is fundamentally like just a very, very beautiful painting, almost sort of telling you that everything can be made sort of harmonious. But as I sort of argue in the show and in the catalogue, I think it's a work that is doing much more than just showing you a dance. It's very avant-garde also in the way that you stand behind that figure when you look at the picture, then you see from the back that is both like making you part of the picture, but also keeping you away from it. So it's very daring in that sense, but I think more than anything to me, and the critic, actually a Belgian critic at the time the work was exhibited, described it as a picture which is only a pretext for an exploration of shapes and tone. And in many ways, this is what I feel Seurat's art becomes about, and which is why it's so tragic that he died so young and we'll never know what his art would have become, but that he's removing himself more and more from subject matter, producing a work that is almost equally about what it depicts, that it is about geometry and color, about those shapes, those curves. Very well balanced picture. It's really fascinating how many elements of echo one another. Say, look, if you look at the moustache of the male dancer and the little ribbons on the toes of on the shoes of the women, even those lamps at the top mirrored by the hats that some of the men are holding. So it's very geometry, very formal picture as well. Two other wonderful works that you encourage you to look at in the exhibition, this sort of bullfight picture, which is so avant-garde for me because you see a figure from the back, like you do in Chahut, but then when you look at the spectators on the other side of this bull ring, you see that they're actually only painted in single dots. So the single human figure just becomes an individual dot of paint, which is almost as simplified as you can. It's almost like the technique becoming one with representation. Sort of wonderful thing. And then this little work by Lucien Pissarro that sort of sleeps in the British Museum that very, very few people know about it in this wonderful little picture, the Café Concert. The penultimate section of the show, we meet this really ravishing painting by Theo von Rieselberger. Large, again, about the size of the screen. Picture of women in a landscape in the afternoon. We actually know who they are, despite the fact they're faceless. They're two women that we've met already. Maria Set, who I described to at the harmonium, in wearing the pink dress, and in the blue dress, it's Maria Rieselberger, the artist's wife. And yet he does everything not to show you their faces, which is really almost quite sort of comical. And there are all sort of different ways of doing it. So one, is the woman on the left is sort of turned, looking down. The following woman standing up is the shadow that's hiding her features. The other one, it's the brim of a hat. The one to the left, to the right, is almost as if she could turn her head a little bit more and you can see her profile, yet she isn't. And then the fifth one is just being slashed by the tree. Almost in sort of very comical, very, very comical way. It's a very luminous, very lyrical painting. And it's a wonderful thing. To me, it's almost like how you can depict people being alone together in many ways. And it's a sort of a sense in Neo-Impressionist paintings, particularly as a group paintings like these, that each figure seems to exist in their own little world and seem to be really inside their heads. And in nowhere do you see that more than in these two works by Paul Signac. It's maybe just about decided that this is probably my favorite moment in the exhibition. Takes you a while to sort of crystallize and then you decide, well, what do I return like every time I go into space? To me, it's these two pictures. There are these two interior scenes by Signac, which have been reunited for the first time in about 25 years. The work from the Kröller-Müller on the left, the one on the right from a private collection. And it's the one on the left is better known, and it's a picture. It's Signac's response to Seurat's La Grande Jatte. So La Grande Jatte showing sort of bourgeois leisure outside, and Signac takes you into the bourgeois living room and actually to his own grandfather's living room in by the Seine in Agnières, where he had retired. Where you get this sort of stillness, the feeling that each figure really is just inside their own head. There's a sort of coolness. You have a maid bringing a newspaper, and actually the woman drinking coffee or tea is Signac's own mother. And it's a sort of picture about sort of coldness and sort of estrangement. And yet at the same time, it's a family that enabled Signac to become a painter, that was supported his this very bohemian pursuit. A painter, not any painter, a painter really at the avant-garde of art at that time, a family that was always very supportive of that. And so it's a sort of ironic musing on his own origins, if you will. But it's a work, when you look at it stylistically, it's very much in the mode of Seurat. It's very geometric, sort of simplified, relatively muted colors. And the work next to it, A Sunday, is only painted 2 years later. And it's in a completely different mode. And you see that even more in the exhibition, because you'll see how it's painted much more richly, it's much more textured on the canvas. And there's a new, I can't know another way to describe it, there's a new sort of sense of lyricism in the way that Signac is painting this work. It's very sinuous, very patterned. It's a sort of similar subject matter. I mean, it's but here even more sort of bold and tragic in a way. It's a sort of it's a couple sort of falling apart. The woman sort of looking out at the windows that was hoping, maybe thinking of a better life somewhere out there. And then the man being turned away from her, sort of poking at the fire, which is almost sort of comically cut off, and you can't really tell if there's any fire there. Is the fire still there? You could ask. And then between them, this little cat, probably one of the best cats in our history. With its fur standing on its back, which sort of echoes the pattern on the carpet, but also acts as a symbol of this sort of dissonance in their relationship. Sort of wonderful painting, and such an interesting comparison. Look at how he treats the man's jacket, with all these sort of curves, and it's very lyrical. And compared to how understated the jacket is on the other side, and you think this is only 2 years apart. Like modern art is evolving at incredible speed. Two great pastels by Henri van der Velde. Again, there's this sort of theme of sort of quiet, meditative reflection. And now the last section of the show, which in a way really returns to the core of Helene Kröller-Müller's collecting, which is the sense that he saw in these works a real sense of, sort of serenity and spirituality, as I said at the beginning, the foil to the rawness of Van Gogh. And you have here the two works, one, the Anna Bock, the evening picture, which is in a way so Belgian. I mean, you can sort of see Magritte there. These sort of quiet, empty, sort of slightly harrowing sort of houses. And then the work by Henri van der Velde on the left, who, as I said, becomes the architect of the museum. And a work that is so spare and sort of constructed of almost sort of 3 bands. And then the figure wasn't there, you'd be really hard pressed to sort of read it. And you really see art as almost sort of subject matter is almost disintegrating as you're looking at that picture. It's a wonderful thing. Two coastal scenes by Theodor Rieselberger on the left. This is the work in the National Gallery's collection, I believe, Theodor Rieselberger in the country. And next to it, a Dune picture by Johan Arts, a Dutch artist. And if you're to bring the two together into one, you get the picture that's hung in between them, which is Angers de Montcross, French artist who painted the bullfight scene I briefly discussed. with this sort of shimmering effects, and the foreground almost becomes a sort of pattern carpet. I mean, it's the most extraordinary, vibrant painting, sort of full of light and warmth of the Mediterranean, which is in a way signaling to one direction that Neo-Impressionism leads into, which is the move to the south of France, most famously Signac, who moves to Saint-Tropez. I mean, he makes Saint-Tropez what it is today. And then there's a new generation of artists that comes to see him in 1904. And these are the younger artists, Henri Matisse and André Derain, who end up being known as the furthest. They take the color of Neo-Impressionism and take it into the 20th century. And then these amazingly spare pastels by this artist called Johann Domercq, completely unknown in this country. And you really see again landscapes dissolving into just a sort of cloud of dots. And then the very last works in the show, a group of Jan Toorop's two dune pictures, two seascapes, which are unbelievably spare. And really, I mean, do go see them and stand very, very close. They're so beautiful to look at. And the one on the left, I find particularly, because if you remove the figure and the wheelbarrow, I mean, it just becomes abstracted horizontal lines. It's an incredible work that he's painting in 1891 as he hears of the death of Seurat, which in some way sort of signals the end of Neo-Impressionism as its most daring. And a lot of artists sort of drop the style at that point. But the show sort of ends with 5 paintings. This work by Henri van der Velde, as you would say in Belgium. So again, the architect of the Kröller-Müller Museum, in one of my favorite paintings of the 19th century, called the Beach of Blankenberge, painted in 1899. And you see the foreground is the shadow of beach huts, and then there's this sort of the beach and then the sea. These figures in the middle are almost sort of like dissolving in a blur. And especially in person, you cannot quite make sense of them. They really feel like they're disappearing as you're looking at them. And the only thing to me that grounds it in reality is that bench. A familiar shape that somehow anchors the picture. Otherwise, it would sort of really dissolve it. Remarkable thing. And this to slightly break the myth, which a lot of the critics that have reviewed the exhibition did not catch on, that Neo-Impressionism is not only about the genius of Seurat, that there are some other artists that are really pushing the boundaries in really, really exciting ways. And for me, Van der Velde is one of them. Paul Signac's probably the most Seurat of all Signac's. The work he paints in 1890, and next to the last, we show it on the wall next to the last series that Seurat paints in 1890. A work that is so sort of spare again, like just, but still very Signac, this sort of undulating foreground, moving, these sort of orange, moving into darker tones to signal where the beach meets the sea, this sort of green sea, and you go up to the sky, and it's a very muted work with these incredible beacons, these rustics of the beacons standing up, the only vertical bits in the painting, which are all actually, they all have names. They also, like a local historian has been able to pinpoint that they're exactly where they're meant to be. So it's really a work about the reality of place. And yet he makes this landscape, to me, it has a sort of incredible sort of rhythm. I mean, Signac is somebody who's very interested in music. And rather the relationship between music and art. I mean, he gives this work an opus number, opus 210, like a work of music. And when you look at it, you almost feel your eye being drawn from one beacon to the other, going from left to right and right to left, like a sort of piece of abstract music. It's a wonderful sort of rhythm to that piece. The last works in the show, which are a series of 3 of Seurat's last paintings. These 2 works from one, the National Gallery and the Museum of Modern Art. This is the one from the Kröller-Müller. Maybe I'll show them to you as a. And this is how we end the show. It's a very to me, I've described it as a very quiet, very serene ending, but works that really sort of pack a punch visually, I find. And there, as I said at the beginning, that Seurat works in series to give you the sense of place, looking at it from different angles. And this is indeed what he's doing with this, depicting the little town of Gravelines in the north of France. It's right next to Dunkirk, where you get off the ferry if you take the ferry to France. I would assume that none of you in this room are from Gravelines. We're gonna have to check that before I say what I'm about to say, because Gravelines is a very, very strange place to go to decide to go spend your summer. It's nothingness. It's an empty, dull, non-landscape, totally nondescript. It's a channel, man-made, that goes like straight into the sea, dunes. The only thing that animates it is a lighthouse, but that's really it. And to me, it feels like it's the place you go to if you want to paint nothing. And by that, I mean, if you want to paint the most simple landscape, if you're interested in geometry, in horizontality, and you still want to root it in representation or in the real world, yeah, you would go to that. And you see how these works are really working as, real sort of studies in geometry. I mean, look at the work in the center. He's really working with these horizontals, the diagonals of the foreground, particularly this green, very muted, very quiet picture. And then I think as a study, really interestingly, the two small paintings that seem to me relate to one another in a really sort of formal way. They're both seen from roughly the same point of view. They're horizontal works, but they're speaking. The work on the left is a day scene. You can actually read what the tidal mast is saying in the middle of the picture, just indicating the water's too low for boats to enter the channel, and so it's completely still. There's nothing going through it. The other work is an evening picture, and the water is obviously high enough, and the boat is sailing out, so there's sort of opposites in that way. But you can see how the work on the left is all empty in the foreground, so this white dune, such a beautiful work. And it's the top that's busier, and then in a work from the Museum of Modern Art, the one on the right, it's the bottom that is the more animated, and then the top is this sort of abstraction of clouds. And so to me, they really function as sort of visual opposites, and really beg the question, what would have happened had Seurat lived on? But beyond that, because I really cannot answer that question, to me, it really speaks to the importance of Neo-Impressionism as this last necessary step for the emergence of abstraction, because that's really what the next generation does. Like people like Piet Mondrian, for instance, taking even the dottedness, and then in a way after this, the obvious thing is subject matter stops mattering. But I think more than just formalism, and that is something that's quite beautiful. There's a quote about these works when we quote Helene Kröller-Müller saying, he sees the view of a harbor Gravelines with the emotion of a spiritual, poetic disposition. Just roughly what she says. And Georges Seurat says, it was the end of his life, it's a quote that's reported to him. He's a man of very few words. Would not have been a great dinner party companion. But he says something like, they see poetry in my paintings. That's not true at all. I apply my method, and that's all there is to it. And this is where you feel like you really should not listen to what artists say about their work. And I really feel like you cannot help but look at these pictures and think that there's just also great formalism, yes, but great poetry. They're so evocative. And that is really the great gift of Neo-Impressionism. And that's also what Helene Kröller-Müller recognized in them, and what we're so pleased to be able to bring to London. So thank you very much for coming.